In reading about your biography in preparation for this interview, I noticed that you're a PhD in history from University of Edinburgh. As you look back in history, are there any characters or events that have informed your views about leadership? Any lessons from history that you've taken to help you as you've gone about your work?
Oh, absolutely. I think, some people say that politics is a profession for which no qualifications are thought necessary, but I think one of them has got to be an understanding of the forces at work throughout history in your own country, but also beyond your country. And I think I've really been influenced by three things over the last few years. One is that no leader can fail to have to deal with the big policy issues. So the idea that in the modern world you can sort of devolve so much that you can actually make policy is I think, now an illusion. I think the second thing is that what's changed over the last 100 years is the sheer focus of media attention.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the big things that people have had to come to terms with. You know, you had prime ministers and presidents in the 19th and early 20th century, and what they did and how they spent their time and, how they had time for leisure pursuits and everything else would be so commented upon by the media now that it's difficult to see how they could ever have lived the lives that they lived in, as leaders now. And I think the third thing is everything is so much more international. So one of the big things about leadership is you've got to have relationships with leaders in other countries. And so much of what's happening now, even in the economy, which was previously left to central bank governors and finance ministers, depends on personal relationships. So you've got to build up relationships with leaders around the world. And I think, in a sense, someone could be a national leader 50 years ago and spend most time on domestic policy. I think now it's very difficult to see the difference sometimes between domestic policy and international policy. And I think when people say, there is no over there and over here now, they're the same thing. Right. I think there's a great deal of truth in that. So any leader now has got to have a sort of global dimension to what they do.
How well does your local constituency, in your case the people of Britain, understand and appreciate that's what the modern leader must do and attend to? Because I would think that they would be a little more parochial, more concerned about their domestic issues and wondering why is our Prime Minister or our leaders spending so much time abroad or building these international partnerships, etc.
Yeah, I think one Prime Minister around the world was called Leader plus Boeing 747 because he was always on a plane. And I think that is a danger because people feel as the electors that they want you to devote yourself exclusively to domestic affairs. But equally at the same time, there's not much in domestic affairs that doesn't have an international dimension now. Yeah. So if you take the big issues of the age, climate change, financial stability, the whole progress of the economy, terrorism and security, I mean, these are all issues of intense importance to people locally and nationally, but you cannot solve these problems. These are global problems that can't be solved without interaction and a lot of work in meeting and making contacts with and building up common ground with leaders from abroad. So I do think, of course, when you look back in the 19th century, I mean, there were wars, there were sort of conflicts, there were sort of interventions for treaties and everything else. But I think as you approach the second decade, and you're in the second decade of the 21st century, I think the international dimension and the domestic dimension are now far more blurred.
Yeah. In the last century, a lot was written about these great men and women and their accomplishments, Churchill included. Is the great man notion of history or of leadership obsolete? Because no one individual can have that kind of impact on the world because it's through networks, partnerships, etc.
I think history is always going to be written in terms of individual achievement because that's what people look at. They want to know about the personality, they want to know what motivated them, want to know what the philosophy is. But I've always found you only succeed if you're working as a team. Yeah. And I think the scale of activity that is necessary to deliver a policy, so let's say we had the G20 in London in April 2009. We, Britain, chaired it. Every other country in the big economies was there. But you couldn't do that without a team of people. So I think you would be more likely to write up British policy than any individual sort of attributes of a particular leader in that case.
Right.
But, you know, the tendency to personalise history and to personalise politics. And of course, there's one school of history, you know, the Name Your Right school in Britain, which is essentially simply about the manoeuvres and calculations and deliberations and interactions of an elite.
Yeah.
I actually think you're shaping your policy within the general forces that are at work in your society and economy, and you must never forget that you're part of that.
Yeah. Then how important is style in leadership today? And I know that in the recent general election that you went, this was an issue, at least some people made an issue of it, and you commented on it as well. You said, if you want substance, you know, go for me. But people get preoccupied with a set of characteristics that you're supposed to embody.
Yeah, and this is as I said at the beginning, this is of our discussion. You know, there's three elements of modern leadership, and you know, one is you've got to make the policy. The two is you've got to deal with the media and get your message across. And three, you've got to deal with the international dimension. But on this issue of style versus substance, clearly, you want to present your policies as well as you can. You want to be able to connect with people as well as you can. But, you know, there is a trend around the world at the moment that almost every government is being penalised for what happened because people are in the recession, because people are feeling very, very insecure. So I think when you look deep down at the forces at work, and you know, if you go around Europe and go around the rest of the world, at the moment there is an anti-government movement, and it's very difficult to say that one particular change in the way an issue is presented or the style actually diminishes the strength of that questioning about whether people can be secure after this recession.
The last 10 years in particular, while you've been a Chancellor and certainly as Prime Minister, we've seen some major international issues, terrorism, the breakdown in the global economy, and you've been at the forefront of dealing with those issues, global climate change. Can you tell us a little bit about the leadership work associated with attending to that? Because you've been an inside player.
Look, we had what was the biggest financial crisis since the 1930s. I happen to think that historians will look back 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and say that this was the first crisis of globalization. And I think deep down, the financial crash was more symptomatic of bigger issues at work in the international economy. So you're dealing with fundamental shifts in the international economy. You're dealing with the global sourcing of goods and services, the global flows of capital. So a leader has got to understand that these forces are bigger than may even they appear on the surface. And you've got to devise a strategy that therefore deals with that. And I very quickly decided that there was no national solution to this problem. So even America on its own could not solve this problem that was sweeping the world where the credit markets froze. So I wanted, with others, to get some international response that was coherent. We felt that the G8, which was the old body, if you like, of the Americas and Japans and European members, was not going to be wide enough to deal with the fact that China and India and other countries had a role in solving this crisis as well. And certainly to exclude them when they were so powerful as economic players would diminish any response and its strength that we had. So we had to make pretty big decisions then. We had to decide, one, that we needed a new international order for dealing with it. Right. Secondly, I think we had to decide that this crisis was not just about financial markets. It was about the very nature of the global economy and our ability to grow in the future. And then, to be honest, I was on a sort of 24-hour clock, because you'd be phoning someone in America one time, and then you'd have to get to Japan, and then you'd have to get to Europe. And so you were really trying to keep the world community in touch with the plans for a major international conference. Now, in 1933, the World Economic Conference was held at the time of the Great Recession, the Depression itself, in London, and it failed. Right. So we had to be sure that if we called a conference, it was going to be successful. George Bush had the November G20 conference, we had the London conference, and really the London conference made the decision that we would inject resources as a world community into the economy, that we would restructure the banks, and that we'd have a growth plan to get us out of the present mess. And I think most people saw that as a successful. There was, if you like, $1 trillion underwriting of the world economy. Right. But that had to be fought for, and it was really not clear until the last minute that we could get everybody to sign up to it.
Was there significant opposition to a number of the plans and strategies that you were pursuing?
I think what we were doing was pretty innovative because it was really the first time that people had agreed on a number of principles governing the financial supervision of the system. Yeah. One of the very controversial issues was exchange of information about tax and tax havens, because people felt there had been a race to the bottom, and that tax havens were, but it was controversial because there are many countries that benefit from tax havens who didn't want us to do anything. So we had to reach a compromise on that, about how we move forward. On growth, we wanted to have a more explicit commitment to growth so that we would be powering our way out of recession, and some countries said, look, you've got to worry more about inflation and deficits and not just about growth. So, we had to have big discussions about how we could resolve these problems. But generally, I think people understood that the crisis was really so big that unless we had a powerful response, and it was a unified response. In the 1930s, Churchill said of the then government, because they'd failed to get an international response, he had great words: they were resolved to be irresolute, and they were adamant for drift, and they were solid for fluidity, and they were all-powerful for impotence. And so we had to do something different. The failure of the 30s really influenced me in making sure that every last detail of that conference was planned.
Did you anticipate a possible breakdown in the global economic system, or was it a surprise to you?
The funny thing is, I'd come to Harvard here. I'd made a speech in 1998 after the Asian crisis, in which I said, there is a global financial system now, but we are not managing it properly. And we've got global flows of capital, but we don't have supervision that enables us to even have an early warning if there is a crisis. And I proposed a number of things then that I think if we had taken up, it would have been better. But I understood that after the Asian crisis, the interest in dealing with these issues, when you've got so many other things to do, waned. But I saw that the system of global finance was not necessarily stable. I saw that you needed global and not just national supervision of the financial system when you're dealing with global financial institutions. But what we didn't foresee was that the way that this shift that was happening in the world would be reflected in a crisis in the United States of America and not in an emerging market country. Right. And we didn't foresee that the new system, where people were diversifying their investments all over the world, and there was all these new instruments, and there was a wide range of institutions taking up debts and liabilities and prepared to take them on. We thought risk was being diversified right across the world. In actual fact, it was still quite concentrated, and so when one institution fell, another one was in danger. And that was something that I think nobody quite understood at the time.
So Prime Minister Gordon Brown, this has been a delightful conversation, so thanks so much for sharing these insights. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
In reading about your biography in preparation for this interview, I noticed that you're a PhD in history from University of Edinburgh. As you look back in history, are there any characters or events that have informed your views about leadership? Any lessons from history that you've taken to help you as you've gone about your work?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's all commented upon by the media now, that it's difficult to see how they could ever have lived the lives that they lived in, as leaders now. And I think the third thing is everything is so much more international. So one of the big things about leadership is you've got to have relationships with leaders in other countries. And so much of what's happening now, even in the economy, which was previously left to central bank governors and finance ministers, depends on personal relationships. So you've got to build up relationships with leaders around the world. And I think, in a sense, someone could be a national leader 50 years ago and spend most time on domestic policy. I think now it's very difficult to see the difference sometimes between domestic policy and international policy. And I think when people say, there is no over there and over here now, they're the same thing. Right. I think there's a great deal of truth in that. So any leader now has got to have a sort of global dimension to what they do.
How well does your local constituency, in your case,
that you can actually make policy is I think, now an illusion. I think the second thing is that what's changed over the last 100 years is the sheer focus of media attention.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the big things that people have had to come to terms with. You know, you had prime ministers and presidents in the 19th and early 20th century, and what they did and how they spent their time and, you know, how they had time for leisure pursuits and everything else would be, you know, some people say that politics is a profession for which no qualifications are thought necessary, but I think one of them has got to be an understanding of the forces at work throughout history in your own country, but also beyond your country. And I think I've really been influenced by three things over the last few years. One is that no leader can fail to have to deal with the big policy issues. So the idea that in the modern world you can sort of devolve so much